Good afternoon. I'm Mara Rudman, Executive Vice President for Policy at the Center for American Progress, and I want to welcome all of you to our event today. We are so honored to hear today from Attorney General Keith Ellison, whom I will introduce shortly. First, a few words of context. This has been an incredibly difficult year for higher education and especially for the students in it. Some have had to navigate virtual learning, others have been trying to stay healthy while attending classes in person. Just last week, Michael Lang, a freshman at the University of Dayton, died of COVID-19 complications. He is at least the third college student reported to have died for COVID-related reasons. For many students also have added stress related to the disappearance of jobs. For so many, college is but one responsibility, along with work and family. And there are dangers for students beyond the virus. We will address a key one here today: the danger of being targeted by predatory colleges, particularly private for-profit ones. We saw this happen during the Great Recession, when enrollment spikes led to tens of thousands of defrauded Black, Latino, low-income, and first-generation students lured into high-cost, substandard programs. This continues as accountability measures are needed in higher education to address racial disparities and protect students. With us today to deliver opening remarks on how to address this problem is a lifelong champion of civil rights and consumer financial protections, Minnesota Attorney General Keith Ellison. Last year, Attorney General Ellison fought for 1,336 former students cheated by Globe University and Minnesota School of Business. He successfully ensured that they would receive refunds totaling tens of millions of dollars. Attorney General Ellison proved Globe and Minnesota School of Business targeted low-income students and used fraudulent information to recruit them into criminal justice programs. These outfits falsely claim the programs would qualify students for jobs as police and probation officers. Attorney General Ellison represented Minnesota's 5th congressional district in the U.S. House of Representatives for 12 years, serving on the House Financial Services Committee and as co-chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus. He also served 4 years in the Minnesota House of Representatives. Before elected office, he spent 16 years as an attorney specializing in civil rights and defense law. Attorney General Ellison received his law degree from the University of Minnesota Law School. He is the first African American and the first Muslim American to be elected statewide in Minnesota. It is with great pleasure that I turn to Attorney General Ellison for his remarks and thank him for being with us today.
Good morning, everybody. And Mara, thanks for that introduction. I appreciate it a lot. You know, I want to start by talking about why student loan debt is such a critical issue. You all know this already, but let's just set the table. You know, we live in an America where we're told this is the land of opportunity. Land of opportunity where if you work hard, you study hard, you can make it, you can have a prosperous economic life. You know, you may not make, Bill Gates kind of money, but you will do well and you'll have a comfortable retirement. But for so many Americans, you know, we live in not the land of opportunity, but the land of economic stagnation. People who work really hard, study really hard, do everything that society says they should do, and yet they find themselves burdened by debt and stuck in stagnant wages. It's because the structure of our economy has shifted dramatically, and it's been literally years and years since we have aggressively done consumer protection and antitrust litigation and enforcement. And what has happened is that as wealth has concentrated in fewer and fewer hands, the rules that we live by have gotten easier for them, and they more lax, and their ability to influence policy with in a range of ways, not excluding things like campaign donations and independent expenditures, have allowed them to sort of reshape the landscape of our thinking as a society. What we need to do, I believe, is to re-embrace the public interest, to say that if we're going to have an economy and a society that we call fair, where everybody has a chance to be prosperous and do well, that we've got to change some things. And I can't think of anything more important than student loan debt. You know, I was in Congress for 12 years and I left voluntarily, didn't lose an election, just decided that I could be more effective as a state attorney general. I've been right so far. And I can tell you that one of the things that I'm so proud of is the work we've done on student loan debt. Student loan debt desperately needs the attention of Congress, no doubt about that. And I'm hoping that if we can change administrations, we can have an administration that's serious about helping students. Open that door of opportunity, making sure that in the United States, studying hard and working hard pays, not the opposite. Let me talk about my experience in Minnesota regarding student loan debt. And one of the weird things about being Attorney General is that other people who work really hard, get to do the work, and you get to talk about what you've done as Attorney General. Well, let's just be honest. The great work on Globe College and Minnesota School of Business was done by people like Adam Welly and Jason Plagenkugel and others. And I just want to make sure that the world knows it's not Keith Ellison that delivered those great results. It's those hardworking attorneys who were in the trenches fighting every day for those students. And I want the world to know that. Let's just talk about lay the land in Globe College and Minnesota School of Business a little bit. Our Attorney General's office, we brought this lawsuit against Globe University and Minnesota College of Business in 2014. That's before my time. And we alleged that a variety of misleading practices were afoot, including deception around how the school's marketing, their criminal justice program was working, their accreditation of whether their credits were transferable, and the rates of job placement following graduation. Following a 4-week trial, the Hennepin County Court ruled in 2016 that the Minnesota School of Business Globe College systematically, that's pretty bad, deceived students to believe that they could use their attendance at Minnesota School of Business and Globe College to pursue careers as police and probation officers. They could not. In fact, Minnesota School of Business and Globe College's criminal justice degree could not be used to pursue those careers. So they advertised that you could be a police officer, probation officer, but they didn't have accreditation to do so. In other words, they lied and deceived students. And I'm telling you, whenever you cut the ability to enforce the law, you're going to get more of this kind of stuff. That's what they mean when they say shrink the size of government. That's what happens. You shrink government, fewer people enforcing the environmental law, fewer people enforcing the consumer protection law, and you get more frauds and abuses. Following, as I said, after that trial, a number of things, happened, and we continue to stand up and push for students. I will say that the Department of Education also found that the school misled students about the transferability, about the transferability of the credits. So we weren't the only ones who found that to be true. So did the Department of Education, not this one. The state court ordered a process for students in the program to claim restitution, which was important. But that was appealed, but the appeal, we were upheld in November 2019. So they appealed it, we fought it, and we won. The school then filed for bankruptcy, a common trick and a common tool out there. And we're in the bankruptcy court right now, fighting hard to get the restitution and the other remedies paid out. That's not the only case where bad actors went to bankruptcy in order to escape accountability. I'll just say the name, Purdue, Sacklers, opioids, you know the story there. Not an uncommon theme. Anyway, back to Globe College. Our office also learned in its investigation that Minnesota School of Business and Globe made usurious loans of up to 18% interest to finance student enrollment. Wow, 18%. Yes, that's what happened. The loans were imposed on students as necessary for them to complete their education. And if they didn't take out the loan, they would be forced to withdraw and lose all the time and money they had spent to attend up to that point. So that was particularly egregious and offensive. The Minnesota courts ruled in 2017 that the loans were illegal and restitution and penalties were ordered, which is exactly what should have happened. Like with the claims for fraud, we're awaiting payment from the illegal lending from the bankruptcy. So as to the students affected, state court found that most of these programs primarily aimed their marketing at quote unquote non-traditional students. And so this is not your kid getting out of a high school, going to a regular 4-year school. These are people taking care of families, people who may be first generation, people who might be veterans, people who really have put forth the extra effort to try to get some education. And this is who they targeted and tried to take advantage of. These are generally students who come from a low-income background, face existing debt burden already, and students unfamiliar with college admissions. They might be single parents and students with little or no family support at all. Obviously, many of them are students of color, not all, a lot of poor white kids, people from backgrounds who might be from remote destinations. Anyway, they took advantage of the students who were probably least likely to be able to fight them off. In fact, our investigation found that the students exploited these circumstances and trained their staff to, quote unquote, find the pain, identify the vulnerabilities of the students, and then paint the dream. Find the pain, paint the dream. So you probe that student to find out what is challenging in their lives, and then you paint some rosy picture about how if they get hooked up with you, Globe College, that everything was going to be all right. It's a slick, underhanded marketing scheme, and the court agreed with us that it was. Until just recently, our case was the only AG enforcement action against a for-profit college or university that went to trial and received a ruling of fraud against the school on the merits. Since more recently, Colorado AG Phil Weisner, an awesome AG, just obtained an important fraud verdict against the College America chain and its ownership. But let me just tell you, state AGs all over the country have been taking on this student loan crisis, and I'm proud of the work that our group has done. If you want to learn more about Minnesota School of Business Globe College case, we have a publication on our website. I'll try to get it into the chat when I get a minute. Now, also, it's also true that in the middle of this pandemic, you find that student enrollment has declined in many places, but in private for-profit sector, where the predatory lender behavior is concentrated, some people have sought that out and gone to that as a go-to during this time to try to build their skills. I was asked, what are other AGs doing, and what are other institutions considering, and what do we need to be on the alert for in this time of an economic and public health crisis. And so, the Minnesota Attorney General's office is monitoring how for-profit college chains are marketing to Minnesotans, and we're sharing that information with our colleagues, especially as the economy is worsening for working people during the pandemic. And during the Great Recession of 2008, 2007, after that, marketing and recruitment by for-profit colleges ramped up. So we do expect they're going to get busy, and many of the consumers facing layoffs or bad jobs prospects were enticed by their aggressive marketing. Again, find the pain, sell the dream. At the peak of their enrollment numbers was like 2010, 2011, which was really in the midst of that Great Recession. People do tend to turn to education when they're not working. And it seems like a good way to upgrade your skills when you get your next opportunity. But you got to be on the alert for these for-profit colleges that have these aggressive marketing techniques and these tricky, deceitful schemes to ensnare students based on debt. Our advice to state AGs and everyone is to remain vigilant. We cannot rely on the accreditors of for-profit colleges and schools to police misconduct. They missed it, they failed. You gotta have your own system. You gotta be in touch with students. You gotta meet with them, and you gotta ask what they're doing. You gotta do community outreach on campus, and you gotta know what students are going through. That is the way, that is the advice we have, vigilance. And for many schools, the accreditors appeared to turn a blind eye to the fraudulent practices. I think one of the things that we should do from a legislative standpoint, both on state and federal, is to say to these accreditors, are you minding the store properly? And, so now, we can't rely on the U.S. Department of Education to safeguard the interests of students and taxpayers. Under Betsy DeVos, the U.S. Department of Education is actually flipped sides and is not on the side of students and consumers. The revocation of the gainful employment rule, a simple rule that says that, your school ought to be moving kids towards the outcomes that you promised. It's a very simple rule. And the new borrower defense rule show a complete lack of interest in safeguarding students and the taxpayer money from poor performing or fraudulent schools. Active supervision by state regulatory authorities, including attorneys general, are necessary. In fact, during this time when the federal government is, actually you got the, the fox guard and the hen house nowadays, state AGs need to be particularly vigilant, and groups like the Center for American Progress are playing a critical role in making sure that the information is out there, convening conversations around how to protect consumers and students, and that's been critical. There's also concern about for-profit chains converting to nonprofit status to avoid scrutiny. The Department of Education needs to challenge these phony conversions, but state AGs play a critical role in supervising charities. In Minnesota, I'm the charities regulator. Of course, I don't do it myself. I'm smart enough to get people smarter than me to do that. Carol Washington leads our effort in Minnesota, and her team is on the job, keeping an eye out for these sham conversions. And as we supervise charities and making sure that we're not going to permit nonprofits that exist to enrich for a for-profit entity or its owners. AG should also consider pursuing debt relief for student borrowers who attend defunct schools under the closed school discharge rule. We successfully petitioned the Department of Education to extend the pool of borrowers eligible to obtain relief under the rule. We have information on that. I'll try to put that into the chat as well. And then also in Minnesota, we co-led an effort with Oregon Attorney General Ellen Rosenblum, a phenomenal public servant, to expand debt relief to former students at art institutes, Argosy, and other schools owned by Dream Center Education Holdings, and following their sudden collapse. We have more information on that for students to follow up. And the bottom line is, when it comes to the issue of debt relief obtained, you should visit our website. That's ag.state.mn.us. We are here to help. Also the question was put to me, regarding the Obama administration and how they took steps to address predatory behavior in higher education space after the Great Recession. That was a good thing, and the effort was a good one. What should federal policymakers do? Should we get an opportunity to regulate to help defrauded students and protect new students from fraudulent actors? And I think going forward, we need to reinstate the gainful employment rule that was put in place under the Obama administration. The Minnesota AG, our office, is part of an important multi-state lawsuit challenging the Department of Education's revocation of gainful employment rule. The revocation stripped necessary protections to make sure that programs were actually investing in education of students and preparing them for good careers, as opposed to just picking their pockets and piling then debt on their shoulders. We need to reverse the disastrous new borrower defense rule, which stands as a huge obstacle holding schools accountable for their deceptive tactics and restoring losses to students. We also have a pending lawsuit challenging the Department of Education's new rule. And we need to remove the loophole in the federal 90-10 rule that allows schools to count student aid from Veterans Administration to count non-federal revenue, which is unfair. So, and then also in terms of Congress, I spent 12 years in Congress, and the Department of Education in a hopefully a better administration than this one should immediately act to alleviate the $1.5 or $1.6 trillion in student loan debt. I mean, student loan debt, $1.6 trillion. It's an enormous amount of money. we need to alleviate this debt from people. It's a drain on our economy. It's a drain on the family formation. It's a drain on the person's individual circumstances. And it is a barrier to a prosperous life. And that barrier is in the place of people who did what we asked them to do: develop your mind, build your skills, start a career. And the people who did that and were ensnared by the unscrupulous are now facing a mountain of debt. You know, the average amount out there is about $37,000. That's more than a pretty nice new car. And students coming out of college right now, it's about $30,000. That's how much the average, and that's up about 2%. But the student loan crisis is not limited to young people. You have a lot of people who've taken on Parent Plus loans. You got grandparents who signed up student debt, co-sign these things. This is a massive economic threat to the generations, and we need to look at it that way. And so let me just conclude my comments by saying we need student loan debt forgiveness for students who attended these expensive, low-quality programs that engage in fraudulent practices or have gone out of business. The Minnesota AG's office encounters a lot of former students of these for-profit schools who want to continue to revive their education, but cannot because the school's closed and other schools won't accept their credits. That's not right. Congress can step in. And these former students are drowning in debt with nothing to show for it. And so let me just say that if you are concerned about middle and working class prosperity, if you want to disrupt the cradle to prison pipeline, if you want to make sure that in America, everybody can do better for themselves by pursuing their education, then you need to do something about the student loan debt. And let me just tell you, and I'll say this to wrap up. Yes, Congress is great. We need another president. There's no doubt about that. And hopefully we'll take the Senate. But no politician, including me, can do anything alone. You need think tanks like the Center for American Progress. You need advocates like the folks who are going to be on the panel, the next panel, who are so valiant, so brave, so heroic, fighting for students every single day. You need the community. You need the people who are not necessarily holding election certificates to push and to agitate and to never stop, because they believe in an America where everybody can succeed and thrive and be better off. Student loan debt is a part of what's the barrier to the middle class dream, but it's a big part. And if you put your time and energy into solving this problem, you will have done a lot of good for a lot of people. That's all I got today. Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much, Attorney General Ellison. I know I can speak on behalf of everybody that was just listening right now that we are beyond grateful to have leadership like yours on the front line, and that was an absolutely perfect tee up for today's conversation. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Tamara Heiler, and I am the Director of Education at Third Way, which is a think tank here in Washington, D.C. that spends a lot of time thinking about how we can make our higher education system work better for the students it serves. I am thrilled today to have the opportunity to host a conversation with three esteemed panelists to dig deeper into this question about higher ed accountability, a topic that has only grown in importance over the last 4 years and even more so in the last 8 months, as we've seen wholesale efforts by the current administration to roll back key consumer protections and provide little oversight over a system that is responsible for not only helping students weather the upcoming economic storm, but also keeping them physically safe. We know that after next Tuesday, we will have a new Congress and potentially a new administration to usher in a new era of reforms for higher ed. And as we've seen from an extensive amount of polling that we've done at Third Way on this issue, we know that both students and likely voters from both sides of the aisle really want to see the federal government sharpen its oversight of our higher education system. For example, in a poll that we conducted this summer, 71% of likely voters, including 75% of Democrats, 69% of Republicans, said that they support federal efforts to strengthen guardrails over higher education so that we can protect taxpayer dollars from going to schools that engage in predatory behavior. And I think even more telling of the current pandemic, we've seen dramatic shifts in public opinion on some of the different policy remedies that AG Ellison was just referring to actually help remedy some of the oversight issues that we have in higher ed just from March alone. So for example, we have seen just over the summer and the start of the pandemic, a 14-point shift in favorability for allowing students who've been defrauded to cancel their loans, a 10-point increase in likely voters who want to limit access to federal grants and loans to schools who leave their students with loan debt and an inability to earn enough to pay it off, and a 9-point shift in protecting student loan borrowers from predatory institutions that lie to get students to enroll. So all of this is to say that greater accountability in higher education garners widespread bipartisan support. And so now the question is, how are we actually going to get the federal government to take necessary actions to protect students and taxpayers from predatory behavior? So to help me answer this fundamental question, we have 3 panelists joining us today. The first is Ben Miller, who is the Vice President of Post-Secondary Education at CAP. And he also previously served as a Senior Policy Advisor in the Office of Planning, Evaluation, and Policy Development at the U.S. Department of Education from 2011 to 2013. So he certainly has a sense of what the previous administration has attempted to do around these efforts. We also have Yan Kao, who is a fellow at the Century Foundation, where she works on higher education policy with a focus on expanding opportunity, reducing inequality, and ensuring fair outcomes for students. Yan also previously worked at the Project on Predatory Student Lending at the Legal Services Center of Harvard Law School, representing students who had been defrauded by for-profit colleges. And last but not least, we have CJ Powell, who is a higher education program analyst at the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. In this role, he staffs the Higher Education Civil Rights Coalition, a table of almost 50 national civil rights and policy organizations. So before we kick things off officially, just a quick reminder that there is live captioning available for today's conversation using the closed caption function at the bottom of your screen. We also invite you to ask questions of our expert panelists today using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, or on Twitter using hashtag HigherEdAccountability. We will reserve the last 10 or so minutes for these questions. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. Ben, I'm going to kick this first question over to you. Back in July, a handful of organizations, including Third Way, CAP, the Century Foundation, and about 8 or 9 others, put out a joint memo highlighting all of the unique and potential risks that the COVID-19 situation poses for college students today. This includes risks of the floodgates reopening to predatory actors, as others have mentioned, sort of the lack of guardrails that we have around online education and how that could lead to poor instruction for students. And also just the reality that schools that may be struggling to keep their doors open may put their own bottom lines over the health and safety of their students. So we're going to dig into all of those different risks more in this conversation. But before we do, I'd love to just first get your assessment of where things stand today on those initial predictions. Do you think that the risks we forecasted in July have stayed the same, gone up, or gone down? What are you thinking about? What factors are going into that assessment? And also, are there any risks that we may have missed in July that you would say should be on the table now?
Yeah, thanks so much, Tamara, and thanks everyone for joining us this afternoon. I mean, I think the unfortunate truth is that the environment for students is even riskier now than we thought it would be in July, and really for one simple reason, which is that the Senate has not provided any additional federal funding for colleges. And, I'm just very worried that the sort of shoe has not yet dropped for a lot of public institutions in terms of state budget cuts. And if we don't see additional federal money, if we see those big state cuts, I think that is really going to enable a replay of a lot of what we saw in the Great Recession that could be really, really worrisome for students in sort of two key ways. So one is that, we saw in the Great Recession when enrollment spiked that state funding did not keep up or went down for community colleges, and that created a massive capacity constraint. And that capacity constraint basically opened the doors to a lot of the predatory behavior, because one of the things that some of these more aggressive colleges could sell was not just sort of the more savvy marketing, but also the ability to get necessary courses to make it sound like they were promising sort of good dreams for people and things like that. And, I know right now it looks like enrollment is down at community colleges, so they may have excess capacity, but I don't think we're fully processing yet the sheer scale of budget cuts that are looming on the horizon. And if and when those hit, I really think that you're going to see that all that excess capacity go away just because of massive cuts. The second element of this too that I think is a little more unknown is what the public four-year colleges are going to do, because I think if you look at some of the moves, such as the University of Arizona trying to buy Ashford, it's hard to imagine a world where, if we had sufficiently funded our public universities, if they'd be even going down the road to look at some of these riskier financial deals because they're trying to find revenue. And so I just worry a lot that if there's not additional backstopping, you'll see public colleges that normally are good actors feeling forced to sort of seek out things like additional deals to cloak some for-profits with their tax status in order to sort of save their revenue situation. And then the final piece we're seeing is that the costs of operating safely for students without additional help are very expensive. And you're seeing people have to make calls about potentially being in person, or certainly, trying to get college football going again, that are just potentially major risks for everybody involved. And you have to wonder, if there was a better federal response here, would some places have been a little bit more cautious in how they're treating students? And, the budget cuts are coming, and it's going to make it a lot worse than it is now.
Great. So let's start digging into a little bit more of these risks that we laid out. And let's start with, I think, exactly what AG Ellison laid out for us, which is the risk about predatory colleges and the reality that the environment right now is incredibly ripe for a lot of these colleges or bad actors to come in and take advantage of vulnerable students who may be looking to upskill or go to college for the first time in order to sort of get through this economic recession. We've seen, as AG Ellison laid out, that 11 years ago, many of these schools ran the exact same playbook. And unfortunately, for a lot of students who ended up at some of these schools, they ended up not completing or with worthless degrees that even to this day, these students are still struggling to pay off those debts. So I'd love to spend some time, and I'll get to all of you about this question, thinking through what are some of the lessons that Congress and the next administration can heed from 2009 to apply to the situation that we have right now to protect students from predatory colleges, as well as how some of the current efforts by the Trump administration may have harmed some of the efforts that had already been put in place. So CJ, I'd actually love to start with you to specifically think about how Black and Latino students have been sort of historically exploited by predatory institutions, and how the civil rights community sees this as a civil rights issue first and foremost.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for that question. I think it's really important to note that this is a civil rights issue for our communities. And the way that we see this is because it's reverse redlining, plain and simple. So reverse redlining is when you are extending inferior products or unfair terms. So you can substitute that for fairly worthless degrees or low quality degree programs at higher costs to minority or underrepresented communities. And so we know that students, particularly Black and Brown students, are paying more in tuition than they would at public nonprofits or private nonprofits, as they are at these private for-profit institutions. So they're paying more than double what they would normally be paying have they gone to a public or private nonprofit. They're coming out with significantly more debt, as AG Ellison highlighted. They're also less likely to graduate, which means that they have to start paying that debt back sooner with a couple of credits that probably won't transfer anywhere, and they are putting themselves further behind in the economic bucket. They're also more likely to default on their student loans that they're taking out. And more than a third of student loan defaults are coming from the for-profit industry, even though it makes up about 9% of the entire higher education sector. And then the students who do finish, perhaps, they're earning lower wages. And so they are getting caught where they're not able to pay back these student loans for these very expensive programs that they had to pay out for. And then you couple that with the overrepresentation of Black and Latinx students at for-profits. So while Black and Latinx students might make up 34% of roughly all institutions, they're representing 51% of students at for-profits. They're now the majority, and that is because of some of these marketing tactics that A.G. Ellison so brilliantly laid out. They're going after the pain points. They're painting the dream for these communities that value education. They're playing on the ways that communities of color are valuing education and wanting to upskill and be economically engaged, to give them a pretty bad deal on what's coming out on the other end. And so for us, we see this as a really major problem because it's inhibiting Black and brown communities from being fully engaged in the economy. You're not giving them the product that you're telling them that you're giving, so you're just lying to them. And you want to make sure that these communities that have been historically excluded because of policy decisions from traditional higher education are not being exploited by someone who is just trying to make a profit off of them. And so for us, whenever we see these kind of things in the civil rights community, when we see someone getting an inferior product, that immediately sends up our antennas. And we have seen that a lot of the progress that was made by the previous administration has been wiped away. And so now we are creating another environment. It's kind of like Groundhog's Day, whereas like we have seen this before, we know what to do. We did the thing, and this administration decided to undo all of those things without any sort of concept of protecting the students that they needed to serve. And that to us is an egregious violation of these students' civil rights and just like their rights as students.
Thank you. Yan, do you have anything else to add then in terms of, it sounds like at minimum, folks want to see a lot of the Obama era regulations restored. What other lessons can the next Congress and administration, learn from that, and or are there other things that we need to be thinking of? Sounds like you're muted on my end. To others too.
Okay, how's that?
That's better. Yep, thanks.
Okay, great. So first I want to say thank you so much to CAP for putting on this event with a unique focus on the risks to students, because I just want to pick up on a theme from what Ben was saying at the very beginning and what A.G. Ellison was saying, which is that in this situation where we're facing simultaneously a health crisis and an economic crisis, the interests of institutions and the interests of students are simply not aligned. In the best of times, they're not perfectly aligned, but when you see institutions realizing Congress isn't going to be able to provide the solutions they need to address the institutional risks that come from a financial crisis and a health crisis, the thing that institutions can do is shift some of those costs and shift some of those risks from their books onto students' books. And that's where you start to see a real divergence between what is best for institutions, the political interests of institutions, and the interests and risks for students. And I think that makes it even more important for us to have events that focus specifically on what is necessary for students. And let's put a finer print on it. I think that CJ and the civil rights community's involvement is really critical because we're really talking about low-income Black and brown students. And I think one of the really important lessons that we need to take from what previous administrations have tried to do, not just from the higher education context, but from the opportunity context, right, from the mortgage context, is that if we're going to have an anti-racist higher education policy, having expanded access to predatory institutions is simply not going to cut it. And in many cases, it's going to be counterproductive. So I see predatory schools as both a symptom and a cause of institutional racism. When you see Black and brown workers disproportionately displaced from the workforce, for-profit schools sweep in and say, hey, we can get you a job. And when you see Black and brown students disproportionately pushed out and underserved through the K-12 system, it can be difficult for them to climb their way through traditional higher education before private schools swoop in and say, hey, we want you, and we'll give you a shortcut. And when the for-profits have drained the financial aid benefits from these students, loaded them up with debt, they then turn around and blame the students for the bad outcomes. And I think underscoring another piece of what Ben mentioned at the beginning is that we've seen funding for community colleges is both helpful for the students, undercuts the mission of for-profit schools, and it undercuts the really cynical selling point that they have, which is we're not harming our students because we're the only ones who are there for our students. That cynical move of exploiting minority students and then blaming them for the poor results is much harder to do when there are good institutions that have appropriate funding that are serving the same students well.
Great. So, Yen, I'm going to actually keep with you for a minute, just kind of playing off of this idea that, this recession, this time around, while there are a lot of things that are the same, there are some things that are different. I think the biggest one being that because of the pandemic, students from every single corner of our higher ed system are sort of forced online right now, rather than the more traditional campus settings that we've seen. So I know that you've spent the bulk of your career studying online learning, and in particular, looking and digging into online program managers, or better known as OPMs. So I'd love for you, if you could just, give a very high level overview of what OPMs are for those who may not be familiar, and also what potential risks do you think they pose, especially in an increasingly online community or world for students of color and all students who may be targeted by these predatory institutions.
Yeah, thanks. I'm glad that you called out this issue of online education. So first, just a linguistic thing, OPM, or online program manager, is an umbrella term, and people use it to reference a whole range of different business models. So just to be clear, I'm going to try to avoid the term. The simplest explanation is these are the behind the scenes operators of online education companies. Sometimes they like to call themselves the online enablers. And I really love that framework, because enablers are good if you're enabling something good, but enablers are really bad if you're enabling something that's going to hurt students. And that's where it's really important to talk about the risks. I also want to take a step back and say, what are we talking about when we talk about online education? Because at this point in 2020, every piece of higher education, K-12 education, knows how to provide an online education, right? We've all gone through that. But when you look at institutions like the University of Arizona partnering with a predatory for-profit school like Ashford to enable a new online university, what we're really talking about is the who. University of Arizona wants to create a new online product, even though they're offering a lot of University of Arizona online to a different who. So what we're really talking about is institutions that don't traditionally have a good record of serving low-income working students who want to be able to have an online product where they can attract, enroll, and hopefully serve working students through an online platform, all while making a profit. That might be an impossible task. And that's why the set of umbrella companies that have been lumped as OPMs include actors that we are very worried about. Because while some traditional universities have done a fairly good job of serving students through online platforms, we also have a lot of predatory companies that have really focused on attracting and enrolling students while turning a profit, without so much focusing on serving students well. That's really been the business model of the schools that we call predatory. And these schools are starting to put on a different hat. Instead of operating as schools, they've decided that it's more profitable and more feasible from a regulatory avoidance perspective to operate as kind of the wizards behind the screen, so that consumers don't know when they're buying a University of Arizona global campus degree that they're actually buying a Ashford University degree. And so that regulators don't have the ability, when they're looking at an institution that seems to be nonprofit from the outside, to apply the protections that are necessary and that are applicable when you have an institution that's really operating on a for-profit basis on the inside.
I think we may have just lost Tamara actually, because I don't see her popping up. So hopefully she'll come back in a sec, but I will just really quick add kind of one thing that stands out to me on sort of lessons learned or something you have to keep in mind, which is that, you know, one of the things that really stood out to me from the last recession was that it takes a long time to fully catch up to the problems by the time they show up. So, you know, I completely agree with what's been talked about already about the need to reinstitute the gainful employment rule, to hold career training programs accountable, to fix the borrower defense rules so we have a clear path to hold colleges accountable when they mislead students and when they do things like mislead students to both get the loans discharged as well as hold them accountable. But we have to remember that those things take years to put in place. And we're really talking about risk that could be occurring today, in the couple of months to come, that's not going to fit in with that timeline. And so I think one lesson we also have to learn that maybe did not get as fully appreciated during the Great Recession, which is that the Department of Education and other policymakers have very substantial existing oversight and monitoring compliance tools, and that the bucket can't only be about getting rules in place. Rules are important for chilling future behavior and creating incentives, but that if we just rely on rules and not the other oversight mechanisms, we're missing a big piece. And, you know, in particular, I would say a greater focus on more immediate monitoring of enrollment, up or down, up as a sign of growth that might be beyond its means, down as a sign of potential major financial struggles, as well as looking more at finances to be sure that we're looking at things like cash on hand, debt owed, things like that, to be able to identify not just the places that are taking advantage of people, but also the places that look like they're on the cusp of going out of business. Because we know that, you know, sudden closures are very, very bad for students and very disruptive.
Sorry, guys. Cool that my internet just completely cut out in the middle of the conversation. Ben, can you just fill me in? Were you following up on some of the online concerns or concerns that you have about online learning right now?
I wasn't talking about online learning so much as just sort of what we learned from the last recession that's worrisome.
Great. Well, Ben, I would love to ask you my next question, which is that I know earlier today you released a post that while it may seem cruel to increase accountability in the middle of a pandemic, you make the case that this is actually the exact time that we need to be having hard conversations about holding schools accountable for their results. So for example, you mentioned specifically making some major reforms to the cohort default rate. Can you expand upon your thinking around why the middle of the pandemic is actually the right time to increase accountability, even though we know a lot of students right now are dropping out of college or are unable to pay back their loans as a result of COVID-19?
Yeah, I mean, I think what stands out to me is that functionally, the cohort default rate has not been particularly effective for several years, and it's not going to really matter for the next several years, because the fortunate fact is, you know, almost every student loan borrower, and certainly all that have their loans held by the federal government, is not paying their loans right now, or doesn't have to pay their loans right now. And so that means we're actually seeing the number of students in default decline. Any results you see from the default rate for the next several years are going to be either artificially low, or I am fairly certain the Department of Education would excuse any results we see from that as essentially attributing that to both the recession and the health crisis. And so I think that actually gives us the opportunity to say, look, this measure is not going to be catching really anybody for the next several years. So let's use this period of time to actually think about what could be better and use it to close these loopholes, to perhaps also supplement it with additional measures that look at repayment or things like that. And the advantage of doing it now is, one, you give it a lot of lead-in time, because you've got both the several years when default rates aren't going to matter, you would phase it in over time. And two, it allows you to see how much these measures do or don't change during some of the biggest times of economic turmoil. Because one of the things we often hear about as a pushback to some accountability measures is saying, you know, it's not necessarily fair because we have recessions and that might affect the results. And so if we were to start running different ways of looking at the cohort default rate now, you would actually be able to see, like, what does a recession really do to it? How much does it matter? How much do we need to excuse it or not? And I think that would ultimately result in better policymaking when we're able to then phase something in over time.
Great. CJ, do you have any other accountability measures in addition to CDR that are top of mind for you that you guys are thinking about, and why you think right now especially is the right time to be pushing for them?
Yeah, as it was mentioned, like we really loved, or we really appreciate the gainful employment rule and bringing that back. And the reason why now is the right time to do this is because right now you have communities of color, particularly Black communities, who are in the midst of several pandemics. And if you are going to have this convergence of a public health crisis, a reckoning with racial injustice, and then an economic recession, and you're going to say Black Lives Matter or you are anti-racist, like it manifests in multiple different ways. And one of the ways that it can manifest is by having strong accountability for higher education systems or institutions, so that they don't get away with profiting off of the backs of people who are trying to get to a better place in their lives or trying to get to a better day, and using the systems that were set up and working within those systems in order to do that. And so that is why I would also add to the Ben's point that this is the right time to kind of have these conversations now.
Great. So I have one more question for you all, and then we'll love to open it up to audience questions. Just a quick reminder, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, or you can ask them on Twitter. But for me, something that has been striking in all of the public opinion work that we've been doing at Third Way, especially with students since the pandemic began, is really just how trusting a lot of students have been, and honestly forgiving of their institutions when it comes to, sort of understanding that, the pandemic isn't any institution's fault, and really feeling like their institution sort of has their health and safety or their best interests at heart. I think we're starting to see a little bit of that faith erode, especially as we've seen, different colleges, their openings and closings kind of be fumbled. We're seeing literal COVID hotspots on campuses, and we're seeing lawsuits that are cropping up of students starting to question the value of the instruction they're receiving. So my last question to you all, and anyone who wants to take this one, please feel free to jump in, is, are there specific things that the federal government should be doing or monitoring when it comes to holding institutions accountable for the pandemic or their actual COVID response?
I mean, I think a couple things very quickly stand out. I mean, one is, looking at things like how enrollment and finances are going, in particular, to make sure that, we're not seeing things like sudden tuition increases on students that aren't explained or things like that. I also think I'm just really struck how inconsistent a lot of the reporting from schools has been about just what cases look like on their campus. And, some places are very, very transparent, and it's to their credit, like they're doing a lot there, and others, they're not quite as clear about those things. And I think that at the very least, greater transparency for students in terms of what testing is being done, what it's really showing, what their caseload looks like, things like that, I think are at the bare minimum kind of what needs to be there. And then beyond that, I think looking at things like, how is the little bit of federal money we did see go out the door being used, and also sort of what are they doing to ensure that pricing is transparent and fair and not sort of big increases as budgets get cut and things like that.
And big shout out to the College Crisis Initiative that's being run right now out of Davidson College, that is attempting to do some of this data collection that institutions or the federal government isn't doing on its own. So it looks like we have one question that's come in. There are nonprofit online institutions like Southern New Hampshire University, Western Governors University, and the University of Maryland Global Campus that seem to have a good record of serving low income and working adults. What are they doing differently from the for-profit schools, aside from having a different profit motive? Is there a path for for-profit institutions to be quote unquote good actors? And if so, what is it?
I'd like to take a second to just respond to the prior question first about what institutions should be looking to in terms of particularly accountability during COVID. And I think that the risk around schools enrolling students for programs like a 4-year program when they know that they might only have 2 years of money in the bank is a risk that is really newly underscored. And that moment of institutional closure can be the moment where students realize that their interests were not aligned with the school's interests, and the faith that they had in their institution to hold their best interest at heart was misplaced. And so I think that as we know that institutions are facing more financial risk and risk of financial failure, it becomes even more important for us to hold institutions accountable when they're enrolling students knowing from the beginning that they may not be able to see that student's education through to the end. And then to kind of switch gears a little bit and talk about online institutions that may be doing a better job. I think one of the most important things is to watch those levers around growth and to watch the incentives around growth. So I think the incentives is one of the really important things about the profit motive. You know, it's the work around OPMs shows that it's not just, oh, the school is for profit or the school is nonprofit or the school pays their taxes or whatever. It's really, is the school incentivized to charge more to students and then spend less of what they're charging on the students' education? And if they are, whether it's because the school is for profit or because the school has contracted with an outside agent that's siphoning off revenues for the contractor or the third party entity, there's going to be a set of conflicting motivations. And part of where we're seeing this a lot is when those relationships with OPMs have a revenue share component or a profit share component, where yes, they're charging money, they're not giving students the benefit of the reduced price for online schools, and they're taking the revenue and they're siphoning it off into purposes that are not aligned with students' interests.
Any other final thoughts here? We have about 2 minutes left. If you guys have any closing thoughts on this panel, if not, obviously this conversation has, I think, given us all a lot to think about as we look ahead to next year.
Just really quickly on the last question, I mean, I think a couple of things stand out. One, and this gets at sort of the outcome of some of the incentives Yan was mentioning, you know, the price point for Western governors and for Southern New Hampshire in particular is just a lot lower than what we're talking about for a lot of these other online offerings. And that at a certain point, price makes a big difference, assuming it's backed by quality. Obviously, like a low price, low quality thing is bad, but that makes a big difference in terms of risk, in terms of total debt load, things like that. And then the question in terms of good for profits, I mean, I think one takeaway is that the industry can't self-police itself. You know, that was a big ask during the Obama administration years. There were all these pledges to create like a code of ethics and a code of conduct, and it just never went anywhere. And, you know, the most effective efforts to rein the industry in to change behavior came by federal regulation, by state agency lawsuits, by, you know, the regulatory powers of different levels of government stepping in. And I think you just have to keep in mind that, you know, self-regulation just does not seem to work in this area. And if you want to create better for-profits, you want to create better colleges, period, you need to have some government interaction there to really help sort of steer incentives the right way.
I would also echo that there's strong oversight is needed of for-profits, especially as they are starting to ramp things up or have already ramped things up. That like right now, we're already a bit behind the 8 ball, but now it's really time to get on the ball, so to speak.
Yeah, and just from my own perspective too, I think we've also seen that it's not always only a for-profit problem. Of course, there is, you know, for-profits are by and far away the worst actors in this space, but even the gainful employment rule, while it was still in effect, we saw some nonprofit programs, some graduate programs, debt to earnings ratios that were really off. So thinking about ways that we can have oversight and accountability over a system in a way that will make sure that all students, regardless of, you know, where they're choosing to go to school, are going to be protected and be able to actually, you know, make it out of their college experience with as little of debt and as much earning potential as possible. So with that, I know we are right at time. I just want to say thank you again to CAP for putting together such a great event. And of course, to all of our panelists today, thank you so much for the thought-provoking conversation. And as I mentioned, this is just the beginning. We look forward to continuing this conversation next year as we see what opportunities Congress and the next administration have to make accountability a top priority. Thanks, guys.